Okay guys, this is going to be your tutorial on how to use Adobe Illustrator to produce a geological map. So if we start by opening Adobe Illustrator, and then we want to create a new project, so we select Create New, and this opens a window where you can specify the size of the page that you want to work with. I'd recommend that you select a custom size on the right hand side, which is equal to the size of your original field map, but for right now we're just going to use an A3 page. Okay, so that's now opened up our Adobe Illustrator workspace. Now, the most important window that you use is the Layers window, and the key to making Adobe Illustrator work properly for you is to have a good organization of your different layers. Each of your layers will contain individual pieces of your project, and one of the ways that I've found which allows you to separate out your field map into a manageable set of layers is to create the following selection. So if we click the Create New Layer button, we're going to add in, maybe let's start with 9, see if that's enough. We're going to call our base layer, our bottom layer, our base map, and to change the names of the layers you just simply double click on the text. Our next layer will be our topographic map. Layer 3, we're going to call this one our sizing square, and we'll see why that's important in a minute. Then the other things that we might want to have as an individual layer on our map are exposures, boundaries, our outcrops, annotations, locations, structural readings, and then let's just make one more layer here called Geographic features. Okay, so now we've got our layers set up, and what we're going to do over the course of the tutorial is import different bits of artwork and create artwork within each of these layers. The columns on the left hand side of the layer panel have visibility functions, so you can turn layers on and off from seeing them on the page, and also a lock function which stops you from inadvertently editing a layer which you don't want to touch. Okay, so for right now what we're going to want to do is import our base map. So what we want to do is highlight our base map, so that is the layer in which we are working, and then simply what we're going to do is drag in our scanned field map. So I've scanned in an example of a field map on 2 different sheets of paper just to give us something to work on. Okay, so we select both of those and simply drag them into the Illustrator window, and now you can see when we look at the base map layer in the layer panel, we've imported these 2 files, our 2 parts of our base map. Okay, so I'm just going to lock everything else so I don't actually drag something into the wrong layer, so we're just working in the base layer, the base map layer rather. And now you can see if we move these around, we can set up our 2 parts of our base map, and we can get them oriented. Okay, now it really pays to take time when you're scanning your base maps. You want that scanned page to be perfectly straight, because otherwise you're going to have to rotate the base map once you have it into Illustrator. So you can see that our grid lines aren't perfectly straight on our base map. So what we're going to have to do is rotate our pages so that they are straight with the page. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is lock the base map and go into our sizing square layer, because this is what we'll use to get our base map straight. So on the left hand side of the Illustrator window, we have a whole load of tools which we'll use in producing our map, and if you hover over each of those icons, it gives you a description of what the tool does. Okay, so to make our sizing square, we'll use the rectangle tool. I know that when I produced the field map that each of the grid squares is 20 centimeters wide. So when I produce my rectangle, I'm going to give it a width of 200 millimeters and a height of 200 millimeters. And now we can see that that's produced a square of those dimensions in the Illustrator page. Now at the moment it's got a fill, it's a solid white fill, and that's not particularly helpful to me. So what I'm going to do is change the fill, and in order to do that, you move the cursor up to the top left and you can see these two colors next to our object. So our object is our rectangle, and we can see that it has a fill that's white and it has an outline which is black, and I want to change that fill to be transparent, to be none. Now I can see through my rectangle. Okay, so I've got my field map and I've got my sizing square, and I can see that my field map, the grid squares are 20 centimeters, but they're slightly misaligned. I need to rotate them. So what I'm going to do is lock the sizing square, unlock the base map, and then pick up one of the parts of the base map and then start dragging it around towards the sizing square. Okay, let's just take this guy out of the way for the minute. We just move him over there, and then we pick up this one. Okay, so now we want to zoom in, and if you hold down the Alt button and zoom in with the mouse wheel, you can get a closer view. So if we line up the corner of our base map with the corner of the sizing square, you can see that rotation. It's a couple of degrees out. Yep. So what we're going to do is have to rotate it. So with the base map selected, if I right click, it brings up a whole load of options, and I want to select transform. When I select transform, it opens up another sub menu, and if I go down to rotate, I can change the orientation of the selected feature. Okay, so it might take a little bit of trial and error to figure out which way round you want to rotate things, but if we just want to rotate our feature by an angle of 1 degree, we put in 1 in the box, and we can see that it's rotated it more or less perfectly straight. It's maybe still a quarter of a degree out. So if we go into rotate, and this time we want to change it by 0.25, we can see that now we've got a perfectly oriented field map. It's parallel to the sizing square, and it's almost exactly the right size. We can see that we have a little bit of a disparity between the field map and the sizing square. So what we might want to do is right click, transform, and scale our field map ever so slightly. It's going to be a tiny difference, and obviously we want to keep everything the same, so we use a uniform scale increase of maybe 101%. And now we can see that our field map is perfectly oriented and it's the right size. It fits that grid square. Now the reason that the field map wasn't exactly the right size is probably just an artifact from the scanning process, but it's easy to change in Illustrator. So we've got our first page oriented correctly and it's the right size. But now what we want to do is get that second piece of our field map to be oriented and in the right position. So what we can do is lock that first one into position so we don't inadvertently move it. And then we are going to grab our second field map and put it into the right position. So we grab it and drag it over so it's more or less in the correct position, and I'm going to link up this 146 and 22 on this part of the field map with its corresponding neighbour there, 146 and 22. So I drag it into more or less the right position and zoom in to fine tune it, and we can see that this second field map is totally out of alignment. It's been rotated during scanning and we need to change it so that it's parallel and in the right position. Okay, so we're going to right click and transform and rotate it, and we're going to rotate it by an angle, trial and error, of about -4 degrees. Okay, now that looks pretty straight. See, the grid lines are nice and continuous and straight, and then what we can do is move the field map so that what I'm going to do is line up this corner of this second 2 with that one there, and there we go. Okay, so it's in the right, it's in the correct position. Okay, we can look down the entire map and see if everything joins up. And what we might need to do is change the scale slightly so that it's the same as the other one. So if we were to transform that and scale it, we use the same scale of 101%, a really small increase in size. Just double check that it's still nicely aligned. The 2 and the 2 line up nicely like that. We can see as we go down our map that all of the lines, the road and the lakeshore and so on, they line up. Okay, perfect. So could continue that process to link up all of our individual sheets of our base map, but just to prove the point, we're going to use 2 here, and we can see that we've made the start in stitching together our base map. Okay, so now we can lock that layer so we don't ever touch it again and we don't ever get anything into that layer by accident. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is unlock the topographic layer and select it. So that's the layer that we're now working in. And then what we want to do is drag in our topographic map, our base map that we're now going to draw on. Okay, so if we just select our topographic map and drag it in, we can see that we've got a nice blank topographic base map which we can turn into a geological map. Okay, so now what we're going to have to do is use the same process to link up our base map with our topographic map. Now this is again where the sizing square comes in handy, because what we've done effectively is oriented our geological base map with our sizing square, and what we can do is move our topographic map into the same position, so all of those things will be geospatially referenced together. Okay, so what we're going to do is link up the corners of our topographic base map square with that sizing square. So we just drag it into the right position like so. Perfect. That's a perfect fit because our topographic base map hasn't been resized by the scanner. And now that's in the correct position, we can lock it. Okay, and we can leave it there for the entire time. Okay, because what we're going to do is produce a geology which will just sit on top of our topographic base map. Okay, now we no longer need our sizing square, but to save us making another one, we're just going to turn it invisible. Okay, and now what you can see is that our topographic base map is sitting on top of our field map. Okay, which is not really what we want, because what we want to do is trace the geology from our base map onto our topography. So what we're going to have to do is change the order of our layers, and the way that we do that is to select one of them in the layer window and drag it up to the appropriate level. So we want our base map in this case to be on top of our topography. So we just drag it up above it, and we can see that our base map is now sitting on top of our topography. Okay, so now what we want to start doing is drawing in some of our geology. So let's go and find a particularly nice bit of geology to draw. Okay, if we zoom in here, we can see that we've got a nice set of boundaries, we've got some exposures, we've got some annotations and structural readings and some location numbers, and these are basically all of the things that you're going to want to put into your geological map. Okay, so now let's move back into the layer panel and select the exposures layer. We can unlock it, so we're working in it, and now what we want to do is start selecting our individual exposures of rock. Okay, so on the left hand side again we have these tools, and the one that we want to produce is either the pen tool or the curvature tool, and effectively the pen tool gives you a jagged line which you can just click around individual outcrops to trace them. And then once you've traced all the way around that outcrop, you produce a digital representation of that. In this case the default is a blank line, but if we wanted to change the color of that location, that rock outcrop, then we would select it, and we want to say, in this case we want to change its fill to be a nice kind of, let's call it a cyan, and we want its outline to be green. Okay, so we can keep that green line mapping method we've used when producing your field map. Okay, if you use that pen tool, then you can see you get this kind of jagged line, which isn't really what you mean to draw. So maybe a better one would be the curvature tool. Okay, so you do the same process. You select the curvature tool and then start clicking around your exposures, and then you can produce a more realistic pattern like the one that you made in the field. Okay, and what we're going to do now is just do a couple of minutes of showing you the process so we can select through and you can get used to it. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 of our tough exposures. In this case, if we move over in this direction, we can just do these quick couple. So it's really quick work. You just click the line around the outline of the rock exposure you found in the field. Let me just do another couple of these, and you can be as precise in your own time as you like, but with the curvature tool it picks up the natural curvature that you would have introduced when you were drawing it anyway. And just this last one. Okay, so we've produced all of the tough outcrops in this particular area. Okay, and these are all of our blue ones with a green outline. Then, just to prove a point, what we're going to do is change the fill for our different rock types. So now we're going to start mapping on our sandstone, and we're going to use I guess a yellow. That'll do. Okay, so now what we do after we've moved from one rock type into another, we can start putting on the exposures of that second rock type. Okay, so after clicking around all of our exposures on our maps, we'll come up with something that should look a bit like this, where we have each of our different polygons for our individual rock exposures that we found in the field, each color coded, and when we zoom out it will look something like this. Okay, and to get an idea of your progress, you can just turn off that base field map of yours. You can remove it from being visible, so you could see that this would be the start of your fair copy map produced with Illustrator. Okay, so we're just going to do the exposures for a small area of our map, but ideally you'd cover your entire mapping area. But once we've finished our exposures, we can lock that layer so we don't make any changes to it that we don't mean to. And now what we can do is move on to our boundaries layer. Okay, so we click our boundaries layer and we unlock it in the layers window. And now we can start drawing on our interpreted contacts between our different lithologies or units or formations in the field. So again, what we want to do is use our curvature tool, but this time we don't want any fill because we're just going to draw a line, and usually we have our boundaries as black lines. Okay, so now what we're going to do is start tracing out the boundaries that we interpreted in the field just for this area that we're currently working on. So I can see that one starts around here. I'm just going to trace its outline, just clicking along where we drew it in the field. And we can see that that curvature, as long as we don't leave it too far in between our individual points along that curve, it kind of interprets the run of our contact very well. And we can move our window across to get it to where we want to be. Okay, so let's just end it there, just so we get an idea. So we've made one contact, and then we can click off it by selecting the cursor key, and then that locks that in. And then we can start drawing in our other contact. So again, we just start somewhere along our contact line, and then we start clicking along, not leaving too much space in between each of our clicks to avoid Adobe Illustrator interpolating that curve in a very strange way. Move our sheet across. Okay, and then we select the cursor to finish that line, and we've drawn our boundary. Okay, so after going through each of our boundaries, this is what our map should look like. We've got our individual rock exposures that we found in the field, and we've got our contact between our different mappable formations or rock units or lithologies. Okay, so we can just have another quick check by turning off the visibility of that base map just to see our map starting to take shape. So now that we've drawn our boundaries, this is where it kind of gets a little bit complicated, so feel free to re-watch this part over and over again. Okay? What we're going to do is unlock our outcrop layer. And what we're going to do is, with our boundary layer unlocked, we're going to select each of our boundaries that we've drawn. We can either do that by clicking on each of them while holding down the Shift key to get them all selected, or we can just drag around them and it'll select everything within that drag space. Now, what we can see on the top right corner is we have a location of those boundaries in our workspace. If we look up here, we can see that we've got an X coordinate of 78.611 and a Y coordinate of 95.956. And what we need to do is make a note of that on a piece of paper, because those numbers are going to be important. So 78.611 is our X coordinate, and our Y coordinate is 95.956. Okay, now what we want to do is copy those boundaries. Okay, so what we do is hold down Control and C, and now they've been copied. And then what we want to do is go into our outcrop layer and paste those boundaries. So we press, you either right click and press paste, or you can just hold down Control and press V, and it's copied those boundaries from our boundary layer into our outcrop layer, but they're in the wrong place. So what we want to do, while they're still all nicely highlighted, we need to change its position to be those coordinates we copied down. So our x coordinate was 78.611 and our y coordinate was 95.956. Okay, and you can see that it's put them exactly on top of the boundaries that we drew originally. So we've made one boundary and we need to make another one, and we'll see why this is important in a minute. So we just press Control V again and it's pasted them, but they're in the wrong position, so we just change our x coordinate to be that one that we wrote down earlier, 78.611, and do the same for our y coordinate, 95.956, and they're oriented in the right position. Okay, so now we want to lock both of those layers. Okay, so we've got our boundaries and our outcrops. So now what we want to do is actually show the color of our interpreted positions of our rock layers. Okay, so what we want to do is unlock one of our outcrops and select one of the boundary lines that we've copied into that layer. Okay, so we can see that we've got this layer that's highlighted, and this is going to represent the edge of the polygon that we're going to shade in our rock type color. Okay, so what we're going to do is take our pen tool and move our pen right onto the end anchor of that line. So you can see it's currently a star next to the cursor, and as we move it over to the anchor point at the end of that line, it turns into a slash. Okay, that means that Adobe is going to start adding to that line. So we click the anchor, okay, and then we can just join the edge of one of our polygons. So this is like the top of the blue unit, and we're going to link it with this line here. So as we drag our line down, and once Adobe interprets that we want to link two lines together, it'll change the little symbol next to the cursor to be a square with two lines either side, like a join. Okay, so we click that on that, and we can see that we've joined the two lines together. It's now this one continuous highlighted line. Okay, now what we need to do is go to the other end of our line, which is here, and do the same thing. So we take our anchor point at the end of the line, it's now a slash, and then add it to the top part of our polygon. Okay, and when we make a closed loop, when we do a self-contained shape, that little icon next to the cursor will turn into a circle. Okay, so we click that, and then we've got a finished polygon. It's currently hollow, there's no fill in it, but we've got our interpreted exposure shape. So now what we can do is click onto our cursor and click onto that shape that we've just made, and we can start changing its color. So currently it's hollow, but we want to give it a fill. So why don't we give it the same color as our rocks? Okay, so it's nice solid blue. And for our outcrops, we don't want an outline. So we change that from a black solid outline to no outline at all. Okay, so we've got our rock unit, but it's fully opaque, which is absolutely no good at all because we can't see the topographic base map, or we won't be able to see the topographic base map underneath. So what we want to do is change the opacity of our exposure. Okay, so currently if we move up to the top bar of Illustrator, we can see this heading opacity, and it's currently at 100%. Okay, and that's no good to us. Why don't we experiment and bring it down to 50%? Or maybe even 30? Maybe that's a little bit too transparent, so we'll put it down to 40. So now what we can see is we've got our exposures, our exact positions where we found our rocks there in a deep color, and our interpreted run of the contact, that's in a more opaque, a more transparent version of that color. So we can do that process again by putting in our other contacts, and we'll run that through together because it's quite complicated. But first things first, before we move on to that, we've finished our tough layer. We don't want that to change. So if we go into our layer window and expand the outcrops, okay, the one that's currently selected is highlighted here by this little blue square, and what we want to do is lock that, okay, because we're finished with it. We don't want it to change. So now we can't edit it even if we wanted to. Alright, now what we want to do, let's say we want to do this yellow one. So what we're going to do is select that boundary again, and remember we copied 2 in, so we always have another one to work with. And what we're going to do is pick up our pen tool and take the bottom of the yellow unit. You see that it's turned into that little slash, and we're going to join the top of that yellow unit, the bottom of that yellow unit rather, to the top, and we can see that when we link the two together, the little icon next to the cursor turns into that square with 2 lines. So we've closed 2 of the sides of our yellow unit, and then we scroll over to the other side, which is here, and do the same thing. So we get our slash on our anchor, and then we link the 2 together. It turns into a little circle, and we close the loop. Then what we want to do is give it a color. So it currently has no fill. If we double click on that fill, or if we select it again, that's probably an easy way to do it, and turn it yellow, and give it an opacity of 40%, then we can see that we've done the same thing, and obviously we don't want an outline. So we've done our two of our units, and now we can do the other ones. Okay, so after a bunch of clicking around, we've made our final interpreted exposures for our geology, and we can see that we end up with something like this. Okay, so again, if we turn off the base map, just to gauge our progress, we should end up with something currently like this. So now we're going to lock our outcrops and turn on our base map so we can continue. And now what we're going to do is have to change the order of our layers again. Okay, we want our boundaries to be more visible than our interpreted exposures. Okay, so we grab our boundaries in the layer window and we just drag them so they're in the right position. You can see that they've changed from being kind of faded out because they were sat behind the other layer to be in front of them now. But now what you can see is that our boundaries are currently solid lines, whereas we interpreted them in the field as being these dashed lines. Okay, so we're going to have to change the stroke of those boundaries. Okay, so with the boundaries selected, let's just take one of them, and we can change their stroke on the top panel. We can change their stroke to be a dashed line by clicking that box. Now we've got some options for our dashed line. We can say that the dash itself needs to be 12 points, but then let's say that we want the gap to be something like 4. Then it'll change the spacing of those dashes. That's a little bit close for my liking, so let's change that to 10. And then we can click off, and then if we just turn off that base map again just to see what that looks like, we can see that we've got this nice dashed line. Turn on the base map again and do the same thing for our other lines. Let's take this one and and this one, and I'm selecting them all by holding shift and clicking the mouse to get them all together. Now they're all exactly the same sort of boundary in our interpretation. They're all dashes. So let's just call that a dashed line again, and it's remembered that we used 12 points for a dash and 10 points for the gap in our previous dashed line, so it'll give it to that again when we select that option. Okay, so now all of our boundaries that we've selected are dashed lines, and let's turn off that base map just to have a look. Alright, let's say for argument's sake though that this line, this boundary was not all dashed. Okay, let's say that some of it was dotted, and in actual fact, given that we have no exposure anywhere really near this boundary, it might be dotted in our final version. So in our toolbar menu on the left hand side there's this tool called the eraser tool. If you hold that down when you click it, it brings up some other options. Okay, so let's say that some of this line needs to be dotted and some of it needs to be dashed. We're going to have to split the line into two different parts. Okay, so we can use what we call the scissors tool if we select that. And then with our line selected, you can see it highlighted in purple here, we can just click along that line where we need to split it. Okay, so if we click there, we've effectively turned our line into two portions. We've got this part here and this part here. Okay, so let's say that this smaller part on the left needs to be a dotted line, whereas the one on the right needs to be a dashed line. Okay, we select that one on the dashed, on the right hand side that needs to be a dash. We select stroke and turn it into a dashed line. There it is. But this one on the left, we want to turn it into a dotted line, so what we do is we select it, we click on stroke, we call it a dashed line, but this time we want it to be like a dotted line, so the dashes themselves are going to be small. They're going to be something like 4 points, and the gap between them might be, say, slightly bigger. Let's say it's 12 points. So now you can see that we've got these more dotted lines and these more dashed lines to show the relative strength of our interpretation. Okay, so just to have a look at what that looks like without the base map in the way, let's turn it off. Now we can see that this is what we end up. We can see our dashes and our dots. So we're getting close to having a finished geological map. The one thing that I would say is we can at this point leave it like this in terms of representing the outcrops and exposures and so on, but probably what I would say is to change the order of our layers at this point to bring our exposures to be above the outcrops, just so you can see them more clearly. So now we've got basically the run of our geology, okay, and we can lock those layers in because we don't want to change them again. Now what we want to start doing is adding in maybe some of our annotations which we use to interpret our geological maps. Let's turn the base map back on and see if there's anything anywhere near the area that we're working on that we want to annotate. Okay, so we can see up here that we've annotated that there's a fine grained transition from sand to silt. And over here we can see that we've got water accumulates above the impermeable tuff. Okay, so these might be important things that we want to add into our map at the end. So with our annotations layer selected, we unlock it so we can actually work in it. And then we select the type tool and then just add in, click somewhere on our map where we want to start typing in. So in here, it's telling us that we that's our font that we're using, but we want to copy in that annotation. So we want to say fine grained transition from sand to silt. Great. So we can put that in and drag that text around to the place that we want it to be. If we want to change its font type, then up the top here we have options to select anything. I mean, maybe something that would work for a geological map. Might be just Arial to keep it simple. And we can change its font size as well, depending on how big the rest of the map is. But let's say we wanted about a size 8. And then we can put it into our correct position. We can do the same thing. We select another text box and put over here that the water accumulates above our impermeable tuff. And we can keep it as, I guess good practice is to keep that text all oriented to north, but if we wanted to, then we could change its orientation just by grabbing one of the corners and rotating it around with a mouse. So we can go through the rest of our map and annotate it as we like, but one of the things that we're going to want to do maybe is add in some locations. So our next layer is the locations layer, and we unlock that one and select it, so we're working in it. And all of our numbers here that are circled are our locations which equate to places in our notebook. So again, we use our type tool and we just select where we want to start writing, and we can add in our location numbers. Now we might want to tell our location numbers apart from our annotations and our structural readings, which we'll add in later. And what we can do is just change the font color. We can give it an outline if we really want to make it more to stand out more. We can maybe change its size. And let's give it a very thin outline, 0.25 point, just so we can see it. And that's probably a little bit big. So let's change it down to being a 7. Then we can do the same thing. So let's just put in another couple of these guys. 145. And it's a little bit irritating because you need to do the same formatting each time. So that's again, it's a bit big, so we want to change it down to 0.25. So maybe what you're better off doing, just to save yourself some time, once you've got the formatting for the font correct, you just want to copy it. So you press Control-C and Control-V and then drag it to where you want it to be and then change it to be the appropriate number. Saves you having to click around and changing the format over and over again. So after a few clicks, we've added in all of our location numbers onto our map. Okay, and again we can just turn off that base map just to see how we're looking. Okay, so we should end up with something that's looking a bit like this. The next thing that we need to add in is some of our structural readings. Okay, so if we lock that locations layer and unlock our structural readings and select it, so that's where we're working, and then turn back on our base layer. But the first thing that we're going to do in exactly the same way as we did our location numbers, we're just going to add in some of our structural data. So we can see up here we've got a 54 degrees. Okay, and maybe we want to tell that apart from our annotations by maybe making it a little bit smaller perhaps and making it bold. And then just in the same way as we did our locations, we'll drag those readings around to be in the correct position. So that one was 54, this one up here is 29. Let's drag this one to be up here, and that I think is a 39. And so on until we've added in all of the structural readings that we want to add into our map. So after a few more clicks, we've added in all of the structural readings for our area of interest. Now what we need is some of those structural symbols. So the first one, and probably the easiest one to make, is the bedding symbol. So on the left hand side you want to select the line segment tool, and then you just want to draw a line somewhere on the map in that structural readings field when that's selected. So the first one that we want to draw is the strike line of our dipping symbol. So we want the angle of that line to be 0, to be horizontal, and I think a good length is probably 8 millimeters. Okay, so that's drawn us our nice strike line. Then what we need is our dip direction line. So again, we use the line segment tool, click somewhere on our map, and I think that a good length for a dip tick is about 2 millimeters. And we want the angle of that dip tick to be 90. We want it to be vertical for our purposes. Now, by zooming in, we can grab that diptych and take it over and land it onto our strike line. And as we get close to that point, Adobe realizes what we're trying to do, and it'll tell us when we've intersected the midpoint of the line. You see, as I move the line across, it says, oh, you've intersected it, and gives me a little asterisk of where the midpoint on the strike line is. And when you release the mouse, you've made your dip symbol. Okay, now what we want to do is select both of those lines that we've just drawn, so that they're both selected, right click on them, and then group. Okay, so that means that when we pick it up and move it around, we pick both of them up together. So now we've got like a template, I guess, of our dip symbol, and we can move it around the map as we so wish. Okay, so let's start dragging it into more or less the correct position for some of our readings. Okay, so let's first of all copy it so that we've always got one in our clipboard ready to paste, and we'll drag that one down to the good position. Okay, so it looks like maybe our bedding reading will be a little bit too big for our map, but it's really up to you to figure out what works. But up on the top right, you can change the width and the height of the dip symbol. So let's say that maybe 7 is a better fit. Okay, now what we have to do is rotate this dip symbol so that it's parallel to our strike as we recorded it in the field. Now we can either just move the cursor to the corner of the dip symbol, click it, and then drag it to the correct orientation if we've drawn our dips correctly in the field, which some of us may or may not have done. Or what we can do is, once it's horizontal, we can right click on it, we can go down to transform, we can select rotate, and then in this angle box we can change the orientation of that symbol. Now if you've drawn your bedding symbol to have the strike currently as east-west and dipping towards the north, you can simply change that angle in the rotation box to be the negative dip direction. So for example, let's say our rocks were dipping towards the east, they were dipping towards 090, then we change the angle of rotation to be -90. And then we can click OK. We can see that it's rotated it to have the correct strike. Okay, if we go back and change it to something else, so let's say our rocks are dipping towards the southeast. Let's say it's a dip direction of 135 degrees. Let's go on to our transform, let's rotate, and let's say that it's dipping towards -135. Okay, we can see that it's oriented it correctly. So it's really up to you how you rotate your dipping symbols. You can just do it by hand, by dragging, or you can actually copy in the dip directions that you recorded in the field. Okay, but either way, we've got our dipping symbols, so we can copy those and then drag them around, and just for time's sake, let's just do it by rotating around to be parallel to what we did in the field. And we can move our dip amounts around so that we don't have messy symbols that are overlapping with each other. Okay, so we've got another couple in here that we can copy our dip symbol down onto and then rotate it around to be more or less what we measured in the field. And again, we've got a little bit of overlap, so we can just select our dip reading and move it around to make it a bit neater. Looks like I actually missed a dip reading then, so we can just grab one that we've already written, copy it over, and then change it to be the correct number. So you can do this process. You can make your own symbol for cleavage or any lineations or whatever else you've measured in the field. But you can basically just run around your map, adding in the structural readings as required. Okay, there's no real point in, if you have a bunch of readings in the same place that are all consistent, there's no point cluttering your map. So for instance here, where I've got 30 and 32 both dipping in the same direction, just to stop my map being cluttered, I'll just get rid of one of them and still keep it looking representative. And then what you can do is basically run around the rest of your map, adding in your structural features as required. So after a lot of clicking around, we've added in all of our structural readings and the structural symbols, and we've oriented them correctly. So now, just to gauge our progress again, we can lock that structural reading because we don't want to change it, and we can turn off that base map again. And we can see that our geological map is really now starting to take shape. Now at this point we could maybe even finish, but some of you who would have looked at maps from the British Geological Survey will have noticed that some geographic features are shown on those maps. For instance, where you have standing water bodies like lakes, for example, they're often shown as solid polygons. So it's really up to you whether or not you want to draw particular attention to geographic features like lakes, rivers, roads, and so on. Let's say that you did. Let's say that you wanted to show off the road or any roads that you have in your area. Then again, what you do is move into your geographic layer. You'd unlock it so you can work in it. You'd pick your curvature tool to start drawing the shape of the road. And what we're going to do is then just draw along the path that the road takes across the area through our bit of area of interest. And we can see that we've traced it out. Now what we can do is change the symbology by manipulating the stroke. So let's say that we want to have a road it's pretty thick on this map. So if we increase that weight of that line, we can see it's probably about a weight of 10. But we don't want this big horrible black line, so let's maybe change its color to be a non-intrusive grey, maybe a little bit darker, to show the road. And then let's maybe say that we want to include the lake as a separate thing, so we use our pen tool again to draw that outline of that lake. We're still using the same stroke width as previously, so let's whack that down to 1 so it's a nice thin line, and then trace the outside of that lake. Just vaguely goes around here, something like that. And then just for expediency, let's end it going something like this. And then commonly on BGS maps, that standing water will have a solid white fill and it'll have a black outline. And then what you can see is that in this particular area there are a number of other geological features. So just to prove a point, let's dot in some of these streams, which might be important. Let's turn that fill off. Which might be important in terms for interpreting the run of faults, for example. That's one of our streams, and then let's just do this one here. And then let's say that we want our streams to have a blue stroke, so we can change that stroke color to be, let's make it different to the tuff. Let's have a dark blue. And similarly, we want the outline of our lake to be that same color. Okay, it's really up to you. There's no right or wrong way to do it. We're just talking about how some geological surveys have their own standards. Now at this point, you've got your geology, but now you want to put the finishing touches on your map. Now some of the things that you might want to include on your map are outlines of specific areas. You might want to put on a grid, you might want to have grid numbers. You'll certainly want things like a stratigraphic column and a key. So maybe what we should do is start adding in some of those final touches, I guess, in a separate layer. Okay, so let's make a new layer and then let's call it our grid. Maybe we'll want to add in our key, and maybe we'll want to add in our stratigraphic column, and then maybe we'll want to add in our cross section. Okay, so for our grid it's really easy to make. We just want to make a whole bunch of lines. So we select our line segment key, we lock all the other layers that we're not using, and then we click on our page, and then we want to make our do our horizontal grid lines first, and we're going to start just give them any old number. So let's say that we want our grid lines to be black. We pick them up and then we increase their width. So if we go to the top menu bar, we can see we've got the width of the feature and the height, and if we just want to make our line a bit bigger, we can increase that scale to a sufficient size. So for our cases, we probably want something a bit bigger. And we can actually use the size of the topographic map as an indicator. So the width of the topographic map is 736 millimeters. So we can just make all of our grid lines change their width to be 736 millimeters as well. So we just align it into position, do the same thing for all of our subsequent layers, subsequent grid lines. And so on. And then what we want to do is obviously make our vertical grid lines. We can select one of our lines, we can rotate it to be vertical, and then drag it into position. So we've got our grid lines in. Let's just tidy those up so they're 100% in the correct orientations. Yep, everything else looks fine. Let's just shift that one down a bit. So now we've got our grid lines. We might want to annotate those grid lines with the correct intervals. Let's call this one 35000. Let's increase its size to be a bit bigger. Given the rest of the fonts on the map, I think a 14 would be good, and let's orient it correctly. And we can call this one 68. And orient that correctly. Make that one 67. So we've given ourselves a map grid. We finished our making our grid, so we can lock that. We might want to have ourselves a key. So what we'll want to do is copy some of the structural symbols from our structural layer. So let's take these two here, and if we copy them from the structural symbols into the key layer, and let's say that we'll start building a key over here, we can put in key, and then underneath it we'll have our this will be our dip of strata, and change its font to be the right size. And this will be our dip of the cleavage, and so on and so forth. Then what we might want to do is have a stratigraphic column. So beneath our key we might have a stratigraphic column, and based on your measurements that you took in the field, or otherwise from your interpreted cross-section or your map, you can produce a stratigraphic column which is scaled to be the correct thickness. So let's say that the top of our stratigraphy was made out of that purple rock, and then the next few meters of that stratigraphy was made out of that yellow rock, followed by a slightly thicker amount of the blue, and then we've got another band of yellow beneath that, followed by another blue, and a thick basal yellow unit. Okay, so we've got our stratigraphic column, and we'd obviously need some sort of description of the scale. So maybe our stratigraphic column is the scale of that is 1 to 50,000. And then we can annotate our stratigraphic column with our rock units and their description. So this might be our siltstone formation, which we might describe as thinly bedded siltstones with subordinate fine-grained sandstones. While the blue units might be, this might be what we might call, just to give it a name, let's call it the Garth Tuff, which we would describe as usually massive with irregular lenses of crystal tuff and subordinate lapilli tuff, or whatever it is that you've described your rock type as. Okay, then what we might want to do is for our stratigraphic column, if we were to give it an outline, We don't want to fill, we just want it to have its own box. And then you can see that we can start building panels around our geological map in exactly the same way as you might see on a geological survey map. Okay, so we can fill in a proper key and a proper stratigraphy, and then commonly what you see on geological maps is an interpreted cross-section for some line somewhere across your map. So if we were to select our cross-section layer, we could draw ourselves a box, and within that we could import a cross-section from somewhere on our computer, or we could draw one ourselves using Illustrator. But hopefully that should give you a straightforward understanding of how we would go about producing a geological map on Illustrator. Okay, so at this point you are pretty much done. You have the exposures that you found in the field. You have your interpreted run of the outcrops that are boundaries, which have been shown their relative conferences by different types of dashed or solid lines. You've annotated your map with your observations and your structural reading in the field, which is all correctly aligned itself. And these are pretty much the things that you would need for your geological map. Now you can pick and choose exactly what layers and what features you want to add or have printed or shown on your map at any one time. So for example, in your final field copy, you might not want to have the locations, in which case we can turn those off in the layers tab. Or you might not want to show the individual rock exposures that you visited, so you could turn those off as well to just show your interpreted geology. Maybe you may or may not want the annotations that you recorded in the field to show on your map, and you can turn them all on and off. But the thing that you have to think about is that your geological map is not just part of a dissertation that you'll hand in and get a mark for. It'll be one of those things that you take to job interviews time and again, so having different types of maps showing your different skills that you've deployed in the field would be beneficial. So now that we've produced our map, we want to just save it, and it makes sense really to save your map into the folder in which your other things like your scanned images and your base maps are. So in my case it's in my teaching folder for the dissertations in our Illustrator tutorial. And so once I've found the folder I want to save it in, I'll just call it our geological map of Kapalkurig. Now as long as you take that file and all of the associated images like your base maps and your topographic map with you, then no matter what computer you use it on, you'll be able to use that Illustrator file. If you only copy the Illustrator file without those background graphics, then they won't register and you won't be able to see them on another computer. Okay, but let's say that we want to just save that. We want to make our file PDF compatible, and we want to include our linked files so that we can carry them with us wherever we go. Now that that's saving, it'll probably take a minute or two to save because they're quite high resolution images, and so the data file itself is quite large. But once it's saved, we can get back to working on it. So once we're happy, we can print our document. So we can go into the File menu, scroll down to Print, and what it'll show is a little preview of our mapping area based on the page size that we've got that we set up at the start of our project. Okay, now we just don't want to try and cram that entire map into a single piece of A4. So what we want to say is ignore the artboards. Okay, the artboard is the size of the page that we specified at the beginning. But if we just ignore it, then it'll print everything. Okay, so what we want to do is want one copy. We want to print all of the visible layers, so those are the things that we've selected, made visible at that point. And what we certainly don't want to do is scale our image, and instead what we want to do is tile our full pages. And when you click that, you can see that the individual pages, like each sheet of A4 or A3 paper, is shown in the print preview tab, and you can see the ones that we've been working on. Okay, now what you want to be aware of is that some printers, they don't print right to the edge of the piece of paper, so you want some degree of overlap between the pages so you can stitch them back together. Okay, so maybe we want an overlap of something like 2 centimeters, okay, which will print like a duplicate part of each margin so that we can stitch them back together. And then what we can do is just tell it to print, and then it'll send it off to the printer. So hopefully that'll help you produce your geological map in a publishable standard that you can then take to job interviews in the future. Feel free to watch this video as many times as you can stomach, and good luck with making your maps.